Today, we're taking on a complex, and I know for many, a very emotionally charged topic: the global landscape of assisted death.
It's definitely a sensitive subject.
Absolutely. And our mission here is not to debate the morality, but to really synthesize the hard facts for you. We have some incredible sources: historical context, key bioethical shifts, and the latest very detailed statistical reports from places like Switzerland, Belgium, and Canada.
And that's really the core of our work today. It's about gaining clarity. For anyone who's trying to follow policy or even just have an informed conversation about this, the terminology alone can be a huge hurdle.
That's a great point.
So we're going to clarify those terms, look at the, frankly, traumatic history that shaped the laws we have now, and then do a deep structural analysis of the most recent national data. The goal is that you walk away from this with a really comprehensive and nuanced understanding of how this all works globally.
Okay, let's start right there with the definitions. This is where precision matters so much. Euthanasia, assisted suicide, assisted death. They get used interchangeably, but they are not the same thing.
Not at all. And legally, they mean very different things. It's absolutely foundational to get this right. So when we talk about euthanasia, we're literally using the Greek words.
Right. Eu and thanatos, the good death.
Exactly, the good death. And what that means clinically and legally is that the physician takes the final, decisive action. They are the one who actively administers the lethal substance.
So the doctor is pushing the plunger on the syringe. That's euthanasia.
That's the simplest way to think about it. The medical professional bears the full responsibility for that final act that hastens death.
Okay, so then how does that differ from assisted suicide?
Well, with assisted suicide, or AS, that responsibility shifts entirely back to the patient. So here, the physician's role is more supportive. They prescribe and dispense the lethal medication. It's all prepared in a healthcare context.
But the patient has to be the one to actually take it.
Precisely. The patient performs the final action themselves, usually ingestion. They maintain that ultimate control.
And then the third term, assisted death, is just the umbrella for both.
It's the catch-all, exactly. It encompasses both euthanasia, where the doctor acts, and assisted suicide, where the patient acts. And this is so crucial because when you look around the world, countries are making very specific choices about which of these actions they are willing to legalize.
So the legal map is drawn based on who performs that final act.
That's right. You see countries that authorize the full umbrella, so both euthanasia and assisted suicide. Think of the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and Canada. Their systems give patients an option.
Which might depend on their physical ability, I'd imagine.
That's often a factor, yes. Then you have places that only allow euthanasia. The physician must be the one to do it.
And which countries fall into that bucket?
That would be Belgium and Colombia. And then conversely, you have nations and specific jurisdictions that only permit assisted suicide, where the patient must self-administer.
Okay, so that would include Switzerland, which I know we're going to analyze in detail.
Yes, Switzerland's a key model here.
Yeah.
But also Spain, which is newer to this, and 5 U.S. states like Oregon and Washington. So this legislative map is really dynamic, and it shows this ongoing global debate about, where that line is between physician support and direct physician action.
To really understand why that debate is so intense today, you have to look back. I mean, the history of the good death it's traumatic, and it really explains why these modern bioethics systems are so rigid.
It's an almost complete inversion of the concept over time. You go back to the Roman era, and suicide by someone who's terminally ill was generally accepted.
Even encouraged in some circles, right?
In some philosophical schools, absolutely.
Yep.
Especially when there was no real medical care to speak of. It was seen as a final, rational act of self-control.
But that cultural acceptance just hits a wall with the rise of the church.
A very hard wall. Starting with theologians like St. Augustine, suicide becomes condemned as this abominable and detestable act, a rejection of God's will.
And the consequences weren't just spiritual.
Oh, not at all. They were brutally material. We're talking about excommunication, being thrown out of your city, being denied a Christian burial, and crucially, the complete confiscation of all your property.
Which punishes the entire family.
It ruins the family line.
Yeah.
So it wasn't just a theological point. It was a powerful social and economic deterrent. And within that theological framework, suffering was actually seen as a virtue.
An path to purification.
Exactly. A way to emulate Christ. So trying to escape that pain wasn't just, a bad idea. It was seen as spiritually corrosive. And that shaped Western medicine for centuries.
It's such a fascinating contradiction, though, when you put that view up against the realities of the battlefield, the idea of a mercy killing.
That contradiction is so revealing. Our sources point out that even when the church's power was at its peak, you still had mercy killing on the battlefield. Using a dagger to finish off a badly wounded soldier.
To end their suffering.
Right. It was a pragmatic act of compassion in a situation where there was zero hope of healing. It shows that when suffering reached a certain undeniable point, that practicality could, and often did, overrule the religious dogma.
And that idea of pragmatism, that leads us to the absolute darkest chapter in this entire history, the catastrophic misuse of the word euthanasia by the Nazi regime.
This is a painful but completely necessary part of the story. The Nazi program, which they cynically labeled euthanasia, didn't just appear out of nowhere. It had its roots in the broader eugenics movement.
Which was already active in other countries.
Yes. You had forced sterilization policies for people deemed socially rejected in London, in Sweden, even in the U.S. decades earlier. The idea of an unworthy population was already circulating.
So the Nazis just weaponized and militarized an existing idea.
Precisely. The program became known as Action T4, and it was, by any sane definition, a program of systematic murder. They killed an estimated 275,000 people they deemed unworthy of living.
And it started with children?
It started in 1939 with a law that forced doctors and midwives to report all newborns with severe disabilities. That led to the murder of over 5,000 infants, often through starvation or lethal injection.
How quickly did it escalate from there?
Frighteningly fast. It moved on to chronic patients, people with mental disorders like schizophrenia, and even individuals who were just considered to have low social status. Physicians and nurses were systematically involved in selecting patients.
They were part of the process.
They were the process. They would mark files with a red cross for death or a blue cross for life. And the methods evolved, from lethal injections to carbon monoxide poisoning. This is actually where they perfected the gas chamber method before 1940.
So the techniques they later used in the Holocaust. They were tested and refined first on disabled people under the guise of euthanasia.
That's the horrifying truth. The word was a weapon. And even when public protests started to rise in 1941, the program didn't stop. It just went underground.
It became secret.
It resumed in 1942 as savage euthanasia, using starvation or lethal injections in hospitals instead of the more industrial gas chambers. The lesson from this is profound. Any system that gives the state or physicians the power to decide who is worthy of living is a direct path to abuse.
And that historical trauma really is the hinge that swings us into the post-war world and the birth of modern bioethics. The Nuremberg trials exposed these horrors.
They did. And it made patient consent and patient autonomy the absolute central principle moving forward. That, combined with people living longer and dealing with more chronic diseases, forced medicine to define the boundaries of treatment.
And this shift really gets solidified in a few landmark legal cases, particularly in the U.S. Let's start with Karen Ann Quinlan.
Quinlan's case in the mid-70s was foundational. She was in a persistent vegetative state, and her parents, based on conversations they'd had with her, requested that her artificial respirator be removed.
Which was a revolutionary idea at the time.
Completely. But the New Jersey Supreme Court ultimately ruled in their favor. It established the legal precedent that a patient, or their surrogate, has a constitutional right to refuse life-sustaining treatment.
Okay, so that's the right to refuse treatment.
Yes.
But then the definition of what counted as treatment got expanded, right? With the Paul Brophy case.
Yes, Brophy was a firefighter who was in a deep coma after a brain injury. His family wanted to remove his gastrostomy tube, his feeding tube.
And the court initially said no.
Initially, yes. The lower court argued that removing nutrition and hydration was different from removing a respirator. They saw it as actively causing death.
But that was appealed.
It was, and the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court reversed that decision. They said, no, artificially delivered hydration and nutrition are a form of medical treatment, and therefore they can be refused. That was a huge step in broadening patient autonomy.
So those cases were about dying naturally by refusing intervention. But the author, Arthur Koestler, his case is a bit different. It's more about an active choice.
Koestler is a really important figure here. He was a very influential writer suffering from both Parkinson's and leukemia. And his decision to end his life was driven by a deep fear of the process of dying.
The loss of control and dignity.
Exactly, not a fear of death itself. He self-administered a lethal overdose, and he documented his reasons meticulously. He really highlighted that for some people, the intolerable suffering is that erosion of the self, not just physical pain. And that really laid the philosophical groundwork for the modern assisted suicide movements.
Okay, let's transition from that history to the modern policy environment. And Switzerland gives us this incredibly valuable data set because they track both conventional suicide and assisted suicide side by side.
They do, over a 20-year period. And this allows us to see how the introduction of a legal assisted suicide option impacts the broader trends.
But first, there's a really important technical detail here about how these deaths are actually coded in the official statistics. And this has huge policy implications.
It's fundamental to understanding the Swiss model. A conventional suicide, what they call CS, is clearly logged as intentional self-harm. Suicide is the cause of death.
Straightforward.
But when an assisted suicide, or AS, happens, the legal framework there views it as the patient's final recourse against an insurmountable illness. So AS cases are coded with the underlying disease as the cause of death.
So if a patient has stage 4 cancer and they use AS, the death certificate says stage 4 cancer.
Exactly, not suicide. And this is critical because it means that rising AS numbers don't inflate the country's public health statistic for suicide. It reframes the death as part of the disease process.
Which subtly changes how the public and policymakers might perceive that data.
Completely. It suggests the issue isn't a rise in general despair, but a shift in how the terminally ill are choosing to manage the end of their lives.
So what did the broader trends for conventional suicide look like over that 20-year study period?
Well, over those 2 decades, there were about 22,000 conventional suicides. That's about 1.8% of all deaths in Switzerland. The rate did drop in the early 2000s, but since 2010, it's been pretty stable, around 1,030 cases a year.
And who is primarily in that group?
The demographics are very clear. They're overwhelmingly male, about 72.5%, and relatively young. The median age was only 52.
Wow, that's young.
It is. And it contrasts so sharply with the assisted death population, which we know skews much, much older. Also, where they could report comorbidities, mental disorders were a factor in 73% of those conventional suicide cases.
So that snapshot, younger, mostly male, high incidence of mental health issues, that really draws a clear line between conventional suicide and what we think of as medically assisted death.
It does. And the methods they use are just as telling. There are really sharp differences between men and women.
Oh, so?
Overall, hanging was the most common method, about 29%. But if you break it down by gender, you see that over 30% of men use firearms. For women, that number was only 3.5%.
And for women?
For women, the most frequent method was poisoning, at around 24%. It really points to, differences in access to lethal means.
Okay, so let's narrow the focus even more. What about people who died by conventional suicide but who also had a cancer diagnosis? They're facing a similar kind of physical suffering as many AS recipients.
Right, and in this specific group, the method shifts again. The most frequent method used here was shooting, at 34.4%.
But here's the really crucial connection. What happened to the use of poisoning in this group with cancer as legal-assisted suicide became more available?
This is the key finding in the study. Poisoning used to be the most frequent method for this group back in the early 2000s. But over the next 15 years, its frequency was cut in half.
So the thinking is they migrated to the legal option.
The data strongly suggests that people facing this kind of suffering, who might have tried a conventional, often messy and uncertain method like poisoning, instead chose the controlled, legal, and formalized process of assisted suicide.
That's a profound piece of data. It suggests that legalizing AS doesn't necessarily create a new demand for death, so much as it formalizes an existing one and shifts away from more dangerous methods.
I think this is a very fair interpretation of the findings.
Okay, so from Switzerland's AS-focused model, let's move to the European systems that are focused on euthanasia, where the physician performs the final act. We should start with the Netherlands. They have decades of data.
The Netherlands system is overseen by what are called the Regional Euthanasia Review Committees, or RTEs, and they are the core quality control. They review every single case meticulously to make sure all the due care criteria were met.
And the volume there is significant.
It's very significant. In 2023, they had over 9,000 notifications. That accounted for 5.4% of all deaths in the Netherlands that year.
5.4%. That's a huge number. It shows how integrated this has become into their end-of-life care.
It really has. And the vast majority, nearly 98%, are euthanasia cases. And most of them, over 7,000, happened in the patient's own home.
Now, the Dutch system gets a lot of scrutiny for how it handles complex cases, the ones that aren't just a straightforward terminal illness. Let's talk about those categories that require what they call particular caution.
Right. The first big one is what they term multiple geriatric syndromes, or MGS. This was about 349 cases last year. These are typically patients who are 90 or older.
And the suffering isn't from one single disease.
No, it's from the accumulation of chronic, non-curable conditions. Severe sight or hearing loss, frailty, cognitive decline. It's the combined weight of all these things.
So why is that considered unbearable suffering if it's not immediately going to kill them?
It comes back to that idea of dignity and autonomy. The suffering is deemed intolerable because the accumulated conditions lead to a complete loss of independence, of self-worth. Life becomes meaningless in the patient's view, even if their physical pain is technically managed.
And the second area of caution is maybe the most sensitive one globally, psychiatric disorders.
Yes, and this requires extraordinary rigor. There were 138 cases involving psychiatric suffering in 2023. And the Dutch criteria demand that the physician consult an independent psychiatrist.
And that psychiatrist has to verify a few things, right?
3 key things. First, that the patient's decisional competence is intact. Second, that the suffering really is unbearable and without prospect of improvement. And third, that all reasonable alternative treatments have been ruled out.
So if there's a treatment that could work and the patient just refuses it, the request would be denied?
That's generally the standard, yes. But the key word there is reasonable. They aren't forced to undergo every possible invasive or experimental procedure. The sources give this really compelling example of a young woman with severe OCD and autism.
Right.
And while there were theoretical treatments like deep brain stimulation, the independent assessment concluded that these long, intensive treatments were not a reasonable expectation for her, given her history. So her request was allowed to proceed.
That's a really important nuance. It's not just about what could be done, but what's reasonable for that person. And despite all this complexity, the review process is incredibly strict.
The integrity of the system is shown by how few cases of noncompliance there are. Only 5 in 2023 were found to have violated the due care criteria.
Can you give us an example of one of those? The one about due medical care?
Yes, it's very instructive. It involved a physician whose patient had metastasized kidney cancer. He had to postpone the scheduled euthanasia because a family member was arriving unexpectedly.
Okay.
The doctor's critical mistake was that he left the prepared, ready-to-use euthanatics in a sealed box at the patient's home, intending to come back shortly.
And that's a violation.
A major violation. The RTE said by leaving the drugs behind, the doctor gave up control of the final act. He created a risk that the patient, or even a family member, could administer the drug without him there. And that is strictly forbidden. It has to be the physician's action.
That's fascinating. They are scrutinizing the method of control just as much as the patient's reasons. Okay, let's shift to Belgium. How does their approach differ?
Belgium's system has also seen a lot of growth. They had almost 6,400 declarations over 2022 and 2023, which is about a 12% annual increase. Demographically, it's similar to the Netherlands, very skewed towards patients over 70.
And they also structure their cases around whether death is foreseeable, similar to Canada.
They do. They make a distinction between cases where death is foreseeable in the short term, that's about 81% of cases, and non-short-term cases, which is the other 19%.
And that's where the complexity lies.
That's where it gets complicated. The primary drivers in that non-short-term group are what they call polypathologies, the coexistence of multiple chronic debilitating diseases. That's nearly half of those complex cases.
So similar to the multiple geriatric syndromes in the Netherlands.
A very similar concept.
Yeah.
And what the Belgian data really stresses is the type of suffering. A huge number, nearly 75%, reported both physical and psychological suffering happening at the same time.
So it's not just about pain.
It's almost never just about pain. It emphasizes that even if you can control the physical pain with medication, the psychological distress, the loss of dignity, the loss of autonomy, that existential anguish, that often remains, and that is what becomes intolerable. The Belgian system is very clear that psychological suffering alone can be enough to justify euthanasia.
Okay, that brings us to the Canadian model, medical assistance in dying, or MAID. And this system provides maybe the most detailed data in the world because of how it was structured.
Exactly. It came out of a judicial challenge, and the policy response was to explicitly separate cases based on whether the person's natural death is reasonably foreseeable. And that creates 2 very distinct data tracks.
Okay, let's break down the 2023 report. What is track 1?
Track 1 is for individuals whose natural death is considered reasonably foreseeable. This is the vast majority of cases, about 96% in 2023. This is that traditional end-of-life context.
So advanced cancer, organ failure, that sort of thing.
Exactly. Cancer is the most common underlying condition by far.
And track 2 is the other side of that coin.
Correct. Track 2 is for cases where death is not reasonably foreseeable. This was about 4.1% of provisions. Here, the most common conditions are neurological diseases like MS or ALS.
And these are people who have been for a long time.
A very long time. Almost a third of Track 2 recipients had been living with their severe condition for over 10 years. And because of that, there are additional safeguards like a mandatory 90-day assessment period.
What's really striking here is that even with this system in place, it seems like they are struggling to meet the demand in a timely way.
That is one of the most stark findings in the report. While the growth in MAID provisions has started to slow down, the data revealed something pretty tragic. In 2023, 2,906 people died naturally while they were waiting to access MAID.
Wait, say that again? Over 2,000 people.
2,906. It means for every 5 people who received MAID, 1 person died before they could get it. It points to a profound and very serious issue with timely access.
That is a shocking statistic. What kind of delays are we talking about?
They were often incredibly short. For people who died because their referral just came in too late, the median delay was only 4 days. For those who died before their scheduled provision date, it was 16 days. It just proves that even a few days of administrative delay can make all the difference when someone is that close to the end of life.
So let's talk about the root cause of these requests. What is the nature of the suffering that's driving people to seek MAID?
Well, there's one universal source of suffering that's cited by over 95% of people in both tracks, and that is the loss of ability to engage in meaningful activities.
It's a fundamental loss of life satisfaction.
Yes, a total erosion of what makes life enjoyable for them. But where you see a huge divergence is in the specific psychological drivers between the two tracks.
And this is where the data on track 2, the non-terminal cases, gets really revealing.
Highly revealing. Track 2 recipients were far more likely to cite these existential factors. For example, over 70% of them cited loss of dignity.
But the finding on isolation, you said that's like a policy bomb waiting to go off.
It really is. A staggering 47.1% of people in Track 2 cited isolation or loneliness as a source of their suffering.
Almost half.
Almost half. Now compare that to Track 1, where only 21% cited isolation. It strongly suggests that for people living long-term with a severe chronic illness, their suffering is weighted so heavily towards psychological pain, social fragmentation, and just profound loneliness.
That completely reframes the debate. It's not just about clinical pain that can't be controlled. It's about a lack of social connection.
Exactly. They may be asking for MAID not just because their illness is physically overwhelming, but because the experience of living with it for so long has become socially and psychologically unbearable.
Okay, what about the other side of this? The people who request MAID but are found to be ineligible, it seems like Track 2 requests would be harder to approve.
They are. Track 2 requests made up over a quarter of all the ineligible findings, even though they're only about 4% of the total provisions.
And what are the main reasons for ineligibility?
The top 3 reasons practitioners gave were, first, that the person lacked the decisional capacity to make the choice. Second, that they weren't in an advanced state of irreversible decline. And third, that they weren't experiencing intolerable suffering as defined by the law.
And the system is having to grapple with some really complex conditions here. Let's talk about frailty and chronic pain.
Frailty is a huge challenge. It was the sole underlying condition in 92 MAID cases. And the profile of those individuals is very specific. Overwhelmingly female and 85 years or older. Assessing frailty as an irremediable medical condition is incredibly subjective.
And what about chronic pain, especially now that the WHO classifies it as a disease in itself?
Chronic pain was the sole condition in 23 cases. And the assessment challenges are immense. Pain fluctuates, which makes it hard to call it irremediable. It's often tangled up with comorbid psychiatric conditions like depression.
And there are access issues.
Huge access barriers. Long waits for physiotherapy or psychological support. Financial hurdles. All of this complicates the question. Is the suffering truly irremediable, or is it just untreated?
And just to be clear, what is the current status in Canada for mental illness as a sole condition for MAID?
The government has extended the temporary exclusion again. So, eligibility for MAID for individuals whose sole underlying condition is a mental illness is now paused until March 17th, 2027.
To give them more time to prepare.
Exactly. They need to develop robust clinical guidelines, training. The health systems just aren't ready to navigate the profound complexities of assessing capacity and irremediability in those cases.
Okay, now let's get to the newest and maybe most politically charged data that was collected in 2023. The self-identified data on socioeconomic status disability.
Right. The goal here was to see if MAID is essentially becoming a way for poor or marginalized people to escape a life of inadequate social support.
A very serious concern.
A very serious concern. And Health Canada acknowledges the data quality has limitations in this first year. But the initial findings are crucial.
So let's start with income.
They compared MAID recipients to the overall population of deaths using neighborhood-level data. And the conclusion was pretty clear. MAID recipients were not overrepresented in lower income or economically dependent neighborhoods.
So the data, at least for now, does not support the argument that people are choosing MAID simply because they're poor.
Correct. But there was one critical finding under the marginalization metrics that did correlate with Track 2 recipients.
And what was that?
This brings us right back to the isolation piece. Track 2 recipients, those with the chronic, non-foreseeable conditions, were significantly more likely to live in neighborhoods with higher residential instability.
And what does that mean, residential instability?
It's a measure of social fragmentation. A higher number of renters, more people living alone, smaller households, a lot of population turnover, a lack of deep community roots.
So it connects that feeling of isolation directly to their social environment. It's not financial poverty, but social poverty.
That's a great way to put it. The vulnerability isn't purely economic, it's social. If you live with a debilitating illness for a decade and you don't have those stable, supportive community structures around you, that isolation itself becomes a form of intolerable suffering.
Finally on this, let's talk about disability. The self-reported disability rate was much higher in Track 2, and the disability community has raised serious concerns here.
They have, and the data confirms that correlation. The concern is that people are seeking MAID not because of their condition itself, but because society has failed to provide the support services that would make their life with a disability bearable. The law says disability alone isn't enough for eligibility, but this data really demands that policymakers look very hard at whether the suffering is caused by the disability or by the lack of support.
This whole analysis of suffering, isolation, and dignity, it brings us full circle to the crucial alternative here, which is palliative care.
Yes, and it's so often misunderstood as just hospice care at the very end.
But the WHO definition is much broader.
It's a global ethical responsibility. The WHO defines it as specialized care to relieve serious health-related suffering, physical, psychological, social, spiritual, across the entire course of a life for many conditions. It's a holistic approach.
And yet, despite that mandate, global access is a huge problem.
A massive problem. The WHO estimates only about 14% of patients around the world who need palliative care actually get it.
So let's bring it back to the Canadian MAID data. Do most MAID recipients get palliative care?
The majority do, yes. About 75% of all MAID recipients receive palliative care services. So it's usually part of the end-of-life journey.
But again, there's a huge disparity between the two tracks.
A critical disparity. For Track 1, the number is high, almost 77%. These are people already on a foreseeable end-of-life path. But for Track 2, only 29.6% access palliative care services.
Less than a third. Why so low? Is it because they just couldn't get access to it?
That's the key question the report tried to answer. And the data showed that for the few who needed it but didn't get it, most of them confirmed that the services were accessible.
So they chose not to use them.
It suggests the choice was not about a failure of access, but that the services themselves, which are often focused on clinical comfort and pain management, were seen as an unacceptable solution to their intolerable suffering.
Which for them was about dignity and isolation.
Exactly. It reinforces that earlier data. Palliative care, as it's currently practiced, might relieve physical pain, but it often fails to resolve those deep psychological and social drivers that are compelling that non-terminal patient to request an assisted death.
Wow. Okay, this has been an incredibly detailed exploration, and we've gone from, severe religious prohibitions to the absolute moral imperative of patient autonomy that came out of the horrors of Action T4.
And we've seen these clear legal structures emerging, the AS model in Switzerland, the highly regulated euthanasia systems in Europe, and this very data-rich two-track MAID model in Canada.
The data really does confirm that this is primarily something sought by older populations facing advanced decline. But critically, for those with chronic non-terminal conditions, it's these profound psychological factors, loss of dignity, and just striking rates of isolation and loneliness.
And our hope is that this deep dive gives you the tools to move beyond a purely emotional debate and into one that's really grounded in the facts about suffering, access, and societal context.
So to leave you with a final provocative thought that's built right on this analysis.
Right.
Remember that coding distinction we talked about in Switzerland, how an assisted death is officially coded as the underlying illness, like cancer, not as assisted death.
Right.
And we now have this granular data from Canada confirming that for non-terminal Track 2 cases, the real driver is often isolation, loneliness, and loss of dignity. So how might future public policy debates shift? Will health systems eventually be forced to define severe isolation as part of the irremediable medical condition itself, forcing huge investments into social support and community services, rather than seeing the solution as a purely clinical one?
That raises the urgent question of whether the medical system is being asked to solve what is fundamentally a social problem. If a condition only becomes intolerable because of a lack of adequate support, then the failure is structural, not just physiological. And that's a challenge that is going to define bioethics and public health spending for decades to come.